July 26, 2009, Taconic State Parkway, New York, 1:30 p.m. It's a beautiful summer Sunday afternoon in the Hudson Valley, and the Taconic State Parkway is flowing with its usual weekend traffic. Families returning from vacation, day trippers heading home after visiting the region's scenic attractions, locals running errands or visiting relatives. The Parkway, a scenic two-lane highway in each direction, winds through the rolling hills and forests of Westchester County, about an hour north of New York City. On a day like this, with clear skies and warm temperatures, it should be one of the safest driving days of the year, but at this moment something is terribly wrong. A red 2003 Ford Windstar minivan is traveling south in the northbound lanes of the Parkway, directly into oncoming traffic. The van has been going the wrong way for nearly 2 miles, somehow avoiding collision after collision as northbound drivers swerve desperately out of its path. Witnesses will later describe seeing the minivan driving steadily, almost purposefully, in the wrong direction. Some honk their horns. Some flash their lights. Some wave frantically, trying to get the driver's attention. But the red Windstar continues south in the northbound lanes, traveling at approximately 70–85 miles per hour. Inside the minivan are 6 people: 36-year-old Diane Schuler behind the wheel, her 2 young children, 5-year-old Brian and 2-year-old Erin, and her 3 nieces, 8-year-old Emma Hans, and 7-year-old twins Allison and Kate Hans. They are on their way home to Long Island after a camping weekend at Hunter Lake Campground in upstate New York. It should be a pleasant drive home, the kind of ordinary family trip that happens thousands of times every summer weekend. Instead, in less than 2 minutes, this will become one of the most horrific and controversial traffic accidents in New York State history. At 1:35 p.m., the red minivan, still traveling at high speed in the wrong direction, slams head-on into a white 2004 Chevrolet Trailblazer traveling northbound in the correct lanes. The force of the impact is devastating. Both vehicles are traveling at highway speeds, creating a combined impact force of over 140 miles per hour. The minivan's front end crumples instantly. The Trailblazer is knocked backward and sideways. The sound of the collision, the shriek of metal tearing, glass shattering and plastic disintegrating, echoes across the Parkway. Diane Schuler dies instantly. Her daughter Erin, her 3 nieces Emma, Allison and Kate, all die at the scene. In the Trailblazer, 3 men from Yonkers are killed instantly: Michael Bastardi, 81 years old, his son Guy Bastardi, 49, and their friend Daniel Longo, 74. They had been on their way to a family event, an ordinary Sunday drive that ended in sudden violent death. The only survivor is 5-year-old Brian Schuler, Diane's son, who is found by first responders still strapped in his car seat in the 3rd row of the minivan, severely injured but alive. He will spend weeks in the hospital with broken bones and head trauma, the sole survivor of a crash that killed 7 people, including his mother and sister. By the time this story is over, the question that will haunt investigators, family members, the media, and the public will not be what happened. The physical facts of the crash are clear and undeniable, but why? Why was Diane Schuler, a respected mother and professional, driving the wrong way on a major highway? Why didn't she stop when other drivers tried to warn her? And most troubling of all, what does the toxicology report showing extraordinarily high levels of alcohol and marijuana in her system tell us about who Diane Schuler really was and what happened during those final hours? This is the story of the Taconic State Parkway crash, how a seemingly responsible suburban mother got behind the wheel with 5 children in her vehicle, while severely intoxicated, drove for miles exhibiting obvious impairment, and ultimately caused a head-on collision that killed 8 people, including herself and 4 children. It is a story about the deceptions people maintain, the signs that go unnoticed or ignored, and the devastating consequences when multiple failures, human, familial, and systemic, converge on a sunny summer afternoon. To understand what happened on July 26, 2009, we need to understand who Diane Schuler was, or at least who she appeared to be to the world around her. By all outward measures, Diane was successful, responsible, and in control. She seemed to embody the capable, organized suburban mother who manages work, family, and endless logistics with efficiency and competence. Diane Elizabeth Schuler was born in 1972 and grew up on Long Island, New York. Those who knew her in her younger years described her as driven and ambitious, someone who worked hard and expected a lot from herself. She wasn't from a particularly privileged background. Her father worked in the trades. Her mother had left the family when Diane was young, but she was determined to build a stable, successful life for herself. By 2009, Diane had achieved many of the markers of suburban success. She lived in West Babylon, a working-class community on Long Island, with her husband Daniel Schuler and their 2 children, Brian and Erin. The family owned a modest but comfortable home. Diane worked as a senior functional analyst at Cablevision, a telecommunications company, where she was respected for her technical competence and work ethic. She earned a good salary, approximately $100,000 per year, making her the primary breadwinner for the family. Daniel Schuler worked as a public safety officer, but Diane was clearly the dominant force in the household. She managed the family finances, made most of the major decisions, organized the children's activities, and maintained the home. Friends and family members described her as a control freak in the most sympathetic sense, someone who liked things done a certain way, and who preferred to handle responsibilities herself, rather than delegate them to others who might not meet her standards. This need for control extended to many aspects of Diane's life. She kept meticulous records of household expenses. She planned family activities well in advance. She was particular about what her children ate, insisting on healthy meals and limiting junk food. She was the one who remembered birthday parties, scheduled doctor's appointments, and ensured that everything in the family's life ran smoothly. To her co-workers at Cablevision, Diane was professional, competent and reliable. She worked in systems analysis, a detail-oriented field, requiring precision and problem-solving skills. Her managers rated her performance highly. She rarely missed work and was known for being dependable. If you had asked her colleagues to describe Diane, they would have used words like capable, organized and responsible. To her husband Daniel, Diane was the center of their family. Danny, as he was known, clearly depended on Diane to manage most aspects of their domestic life. He worked his shifts as a public safety officer, came home, spent time with the kids, but left most of the planning and decision-making to Diane. Their marriage appeared stable, if not particularly romantic. They had been together since the early 1990s, had built a life and raised 2 children together. There were no obvious signs of marital discord or serious problems. To her children, Diane was an attentive if strict mother. She enforced rules about bedtime, television, and healthy eating. She spent time with Brian and Erin, took them to activities, read to them, played with them. She was not the kind of mother who was overly permissive or indulgent, but she was involved and present. Both children appeared to be healthy, well-adjusted, and properly cared for. Diane was also close to her brother Warren Hance and his wife Jackie. Warren was Diane's younger brother, and the 2 siblings had maintained a strong relationship into adulthood. Warren and Jackie had 3 daughters, Emma, Allison and Kate, and the 2 families spent time together regularly. The cousins played together, the families celebrated holidays together, and they occasionally took joint vacations or weekend trips. This closeness was why, in July 2009, Diane and Danny took Warren and Jackie's 3 daughters along on a camping trip to Hunter Lake Campground in upstate New York. It was meant to be a fun summer weekend, camping, swimming, time in nature, bonding between cousins. Warren and Jackie stayed home on Long Island, enjoying a rare weekend without the kids. Diane, Danny and the 5 children headed upstate for what should have been a pleasant, uneventful camping trip. But beneath this facade of suburban normalcy, there were cracks that few people saw. Diane's need for control, her reluctance to ask for help, her determination to appear capable at all times, these traits that seemed like strengths were also vulnerabilities. People who needed to be in control all the time often struggled to admit when they were overwhelmed or when they needed support. People who prided themselves on competence often hid their struggles, fearing that any admission of difficulty would undermine their carefully maintained image. And there were other signs, visible only in retrospect, that suggested Diane's life was not as perfectly managed as it appeared. She had an unusually high tolerance for physical discomfort and pain, often ignoring dental problems or other health issues rather than seeking treatment. Some family members would later recall that Diane occasionally drank more than seemed typical, though she never appeared drunk in their presence. She was sometimes short-tempered or irritable in ways that seemed out of proportion to the situation. She occasionally isolated herself when stressed, withdrawing rather than reaching out for support. But these were subtle signs, easily explained away, or attributed to the normal stresses of working full-time while raising 2 young children. Nobody who knew Diane thought she had a serious problem. Nobody suspected she was concealing anything significant. To everyone around her, Diane Schuler was simply a responsible, hard-working mother and professional who had her life together. This made what happened on July 26, 2009, all the more shocking and incomprehensible. The weekend began normally enough. On Friday, July 24, 2009, Diane and Daniel Schuler, along with their 2 children and their 3 nieces, drove north from Long Island to Hunter Lake Campground in Parksville, New York. The campground, located in the Catskill Mountains region about 90 miles northwest of New York City, was a popular destination for families from the metropolitan area seeking a weekend escape to nature. Hunter Lake Campground offered the typical amenities of a commercial campground: campsites with electrical hookups, restrooms, showers, a lake for swimming, playgrounds for children. It wasn't wilderness camping, but rather the family-friendly variety where people could sleep in tents or RVs while still having access to modern conveniences. For families with young children, it was an ideal compromise, the experience of camping without being too far from civilization. The Schulers set up camp, and by all accounts the weekend proceeded normally. The weather was good. The children played together, swam in the lake, enjoyed the freedom of being outdoors. Diane and Danny supervised the kids, prepared meals, handled the logistics of camping with 5 children ranging in age from 2 to 8 years old. Other campers noticed the family but saw nothing unusual or concerning. Danny Schuler would later say that Diane seemed normal throughout the weekend, not drinking excessively, not exhibiting any unusual behavior, not appearing stressed or upset. The children were having fun. It was a typical camping weekend, the kind of experience the Schulers had shared before and expected to share again. On Sunday morning, July 26, the family began preparing to break camp and return home to Long Island. This was where the first signs of trouble emerged, though their significance would only become clear later. According to Danny's account, Diane woke up that morning complaining that she didn't feel well. She said she had an upset stomach or possibly the beginnings of a migraine, but Diane characteristically insisted she was fine to drive home. She wanted to get on the road, get the kids home, get back to normal life. The original plan had been for the family to return home together in Daniel's truck, towing the camping equipment. But at some point that morning the plan changed. Danny decided to drive separately, taking the camping gear in the truck, while Diane would take the 5 children in the red Windstar minivan and drive straight home. This decision, which seemed insignificant at the time, would have fatal consequences. Why the change in plans? Danny would later explain that it made sense logistically. He could pack up the camping equipment more efficiently without 5 children in the vehicle, and Diane could get the kids home more quickly. But this decision also meant that Diane would be alone with the children, with no other adult present to observe her condition or offer to take over driving if she was impaired. The family left Hunter Lake Campground sometime between 9 o'clock and 9:30 a.m. Danny drove off in the truck, heading home via his own route. Diane loaded the 5 children into the minivan, Brian and Erin in their car seats, Emma, Alison and Kate in the other seats, and began the drive back to Long Island. The route she planned to take would lead her south through the Catskills, connecting to Interstate 87, the New York State Thruway southbound, then eventually to the Taconic State Parkway heading south, which would lead to Long Island. For the first part of the trip, everything seemed normal, or at least nobody noticed anything wrong. Diane stopped at a McDonald's restaurant off Route 17 in Liberty, New York, at approximately 9:30 a.m. Surveillance video from the McDonald's would later show Diane with the children, ordering food, appearing to function normally. She ordered chicken McNuggets for the children, and an orange juice for herself. The McDonald's staff noticed nothing unusual about her behavior, but what happened during the next several hours remains partially shrouded in mystery, with only fragmentary evidence, cell phone records, surveillance footage, witness accounts to reconstruct Diane's movements and state of mind. What is clear is that at some point during this period, Diane either consumed or was already under the influence of a massive amount of alcohol and marijuana. What is unclear is when exactly this occurred, whether her impairment was intentional or accidental, and why she continued to drive with 5 children in her vehicle, even as her condition deteriorated. After leaving the McDonald's, Diane and the children continued driving south. At approximately 10 a.m. she stopped at a Sunoco gas station in Liberty. Surveillance footage shows her going into the convenience store attached to the gas station. An employee would later recall that Diane bought orange juice and some sort of painkiller, possibly over-the-counter medication, though the exact product was never definitively established. The employee noticed nothing unusual about Diane's behavior or appearance. This was the last confirmed stop Diane made before the accident, though there may have been other stops that went unrecorded. At some point, either before leaving the campground, at one of these stops, or during the drive itself, Diane consumed or was exposed to alcohol and marijuana. The toxicology report conducted after the accident would reveal that at the time of the crash, Diane's blood alcohol content was 0.19%, more than twice the legal limit of 0.08%. Her stomach and intestinal contents showed even higher alcohol levels, suggesting she had consumed alcohol relatively shortly before the crash. Marijuana was found in her blood and urine, indicating she had used cannabis at some point before or during the trip. These findings would later spark fierce controversy and denial from Diane's family, but the evidence was clear and confirmed by multiple independent tests. Diane Schuler was severely intoxicated while driving that minivan full of children. But understanding that Diane was drunk and high still doesn't fully explain what happened during those crucial hours between leaving the campground and the final crash. The timeline of that morning, reconstructed from cell phone records, witness statements and surveillance footage, reveals a deteriorating situation that multiple people observed but nobody could stop. After the Sunoco gas station stop around 10 a.m., Diane continued driving south with the 5 children. She would have merged onto Route 17, then connected to Interstate 87 South, the New York State Thruway. This was a straightforward route, one that any experienced driver familiar with the area would know. Diane had driven these roads before. Under normal circumstances, she should have been able to navigate home without difficulty. But somewhere along this route, Diane's condition began to deteriorate visibly. Other drivers on the road would later report seeing the red minivan being driven erratically, weaving between lanes, driving unusually slowly or quickly, nearly causing accidents. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Diane called her brother Warren Hance from her cell phone. Warren was at home on Long Island with his wife Jackie, enjoying their kid-free weekend and expecting Diane to bring their 3 daughters home later that afternoon. The phone call was brief and, according to Warren, didn't seem particularly alarming at the time. Diane told Warren that she wasn't feeling well. She said she felt disoriented, couldn't see clearly, and mentioned she might have double vision. Warren, concerned, asked where she was. Diane's response was vague and confused. She wasn't sure exactly where she was on the highway. Warren told her to pull over and wait, that he would come get her and the kids. Diane said okay, and the call ended. Warren immediately tried calling Diane back, but she didn't answer. He called repeatedly over the next several minutes, no answer. Growing increasingly worried, Warren got in his car and started driving north, hoping to intercept Diane and get his daughters to safety. But he had no way of knowing exactly where Diane was or which route she was taking. He could only drive and hope to find her before something terrible happened. At approximately 10:45 a.m., witnesses reported seeing the red Windstar minivan pulled over on the side of Interstate 87, near exit 17 in Sloatsburg, New York. The van was parked partially on the shoulder and partially in the grass near a guardrail. Several motorists later reported seeing the van stopped there, and at least one witness said they saw Diane get out of the vehicle, walk around to the rear, and appear to be looking at something, or possibly vomiting. The children were visible inside the vehicle. One witness who pulled over to see if Diane needed help reported that she waved them away, indicating she didn't need assistance. The witness noted that Diane appeared disoriented or confused, but didn't seem to be in immediate danger. The witness drove away, never knowing that within the hour, everyone in that minivan except one child would be dead. Why Diane pulled over at this location is unclear. Perhaps she was feeling too sick to continue. Perhaps she was responding to Warren's advice to stop driving. Perhaps some part of her brain, still functioning despite the massive intoxication, recognized that something was terribly wrong. But whatever caused her to stop, it wasn't enough to make her give up control. She didn't call 911. She didn't flag down help. She didn't hand over the keys to someone else. After a few minutes, witnesses estimated between 10 and 15 minutes, Diane got back in the minivan and continued driving. This is one of the most haunting aspects of the entire tragedy. Diane had multiple opportunities to stop, to get help, to remove herself and the children from danger. Other drivers tried to help her. Her brother told her to pull over and wait. She herself recognized something was wrong. She told Warren she couldn't see clearly, that she felt disoriented. Yet she kept driving. The question that would torment everyone later was why? Why did she continue when she knew something was wrong? At approximately 11 a.m., Diane called Warren again. This call would be the last contact anyone would have with Diane Schuler while she was alive. Emma Hans, Diane's 8-year-old niece, actually spoke on the phone. Emma told her father that there's something wrong with Aunt Diane. She said Diane couldn't see and couldn't speak clearly. Warren could hear his daughter's voice, frightened and confused, trying to communicate that they needed help. Warren tried to keep Emma on the line, tried to ask where they were, tried to tell them to pull over and stop, but the connection was poor, or the phone was dropped, or handed back to Diane. Warren heard Diane's voice in the background, slurred and incomprehensible. Then the call ended. Warren tried calling back immediately, no answer. He kept trying, still no answer. His 3 daughters were in a vehicle with someone who clearly couldn't drive safely, and he was powerless to reach them. Jackie Hans, hearing Warren's side of these phone calls, understood that something was catastrophically wrong. Their daughters were in danger, and they couldn't reach them. The feeling of helplessness must have been unbearable, knowing your children need help, knowing they're scared, knowing there's an emergency unfolding, but being unable to do anything about it. Warren continued driving north, hoping desperately to find the minivan, while Jackie began calling 911 to report the situation. At approximately 11:30 a.m., witnesses reported seeing the red Windstar minivan at the Ramapo rest stop on Interstate 87. The van pulled into the rest area and parked near the building. Again, witnesses saw Diane get out of the vehicle. One witness reported that she appeared to be stumbling or walking unsteadily. Another witness said she went inside the building, though what she did inside was never clearly established. No surveillance footage from inside the rest area was recovered or preserved. After a few minutes, Diane returned to the minivan and got back behind the wheel. By this point, it was approximately 11:40 a.m. The children had been in the vehicle with an increasingly impaired driver for over 2 hours. Emma had told her father something was wrong. Multiple witnesses had seen Diane exhibiting obvious signs of distress or impairment, yet still, nobody stopped her from driving away. This raises troubling questions about bystander intervention and public safety. Several witnesses saw Diane and noticed something was wrong. She was stumbling, she looked disoriented, her vehicle was being driven erratically. Yet nobody called 911, except Jackie Hans from Long Island, who didn't have a specific location to report. Nobody physically intervened to stop Diane from driving. Nobody took the keys away, or insisted on calling help for the children. It's easy to judge these witnesses harshly in retrospect, knowing what happened next. But in the moment, they had no way of knowing how impaired Diane truly was, or how imminent the danger was. They saw someone who looked sick or tired, not necessarily drunk. They offered help, and Diane refused it. They had no legal authority to detain her or take her keys. And in our society, there's a strong cultural reluctance to interfere in other people's business, especially when the person insists they're fine. Still, the fact remains that multiple people saw warning signs and nobody was able or willing to stop the tragedy that was now unfolding. From the Ramapo rest area, Diane had several route options to continue south toward Long Island. The most direct route would have been to continue on Interstate 87 south to the Tappan Zee Bridge, then take Interstate 287 or Interstate 95 south toward Long Island. Alternatively, she could take the Palisades Interstate Parkway south, or she could take the Taconic State Parkway south. For reasons that remain unclear, whether due to confusion, disorientation, or intentional choice, Diane chose the Taconic State Parkway. The Taconic State Parkway is a scenic highway that runs north-south through the Hudson Valley, connecting the New York City metropolitan area to upstate New York. Built in the 1920s and 1930s, it's known for its winding route through attractive countryside, with the parkway following the natural contours of the landscape rather than cutting straight paths through it. This makes it a pleasant drive for tourists and locals who appreciate scenic routes, but it also makes it less forgiving than modern highways. The curves are tighter, the sight lines shorter, the shoulders narrower. Diane would have exited Interstate 87 and merged onto the Taconic State Parkway heading south. Based on witness reports and the location where she ultimately entered the northbound lanes going the wrong way, investigators believe Diane exited Interstate 87 at or near the interchange with the Taconic, then somehow ended up on an entrance ramp that led to the northbound lanes of the parkway. Exactly how this happened has never been definitively established. There are several possibilities. First, Diane may have become confused at the interchange and taken the wrong ramp, not realizing she was entering the highway going the wrong direction. Highway interchanges can be confusing even for sober drivers, especially when multiple routes converge. In her impaired state, with severely compromised judgment and spatial awareness, Diane may simply have made a wrong turn and not realized her error until she was already on the highway going the wrong way. Second, Diane may have intentionally driven the wrong way as a form of suicide, intending to cause a head-on collision. This theory, which her family vehemently rejects, is supported by the fact that Diane continued driving the wrong way for nearly 2 miles, had multiple opportunities to recognize her error and correct it, yet continued at high speed directly into oncoming traffic. The theory suggests that Diane, realizing what she had done driving drunk with children in the car, or dealing with some other psychological crisis, made the decision to end her life and took the children with her. Third, Diane may have been so severely impaired that she literally couldn't process what was happening around her. At a blood alcohol content of 0.19%, combined with marijuana intoxication, her cognitive functions would have been severely compromised. She may have been experiencing tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, and profound confusion. She may have thought she was driving correctly even as other drivers honked, flashed lights, and swerved to avoid her. The truth is likely some combination of these factors, and we will never know with certainty what was going through Diane's mind during those final minutes. What we do know is that at approximately 1:30 p.m., Diane Schuler entered the northbound lanes of the Taconic State Parkway heading south, directly into oncoming traffic. Witnesses immediately noticed the red minivan going the wrong way. Multiple drivers called 911 to report a wrong-way driver on the Taconic. The first call came in at approximately 1:33 p.m., just minutes after Diane entered the highway going the wrong direction. The caller reported a red minivan, possibly a Ford, traveling south in the northbound lanes near the Pleasantville Road exit. The dispatcher immediately broadcast an alert to state police units in the area. More calls flooded in over the next 2 minutes. Drivers were honking, flashing lights, even yelling out windows trying to get the driver's attention. One witness later said they pulled alongside the minivan and tried to wave at the driver, but the driver, Diane, stared straight ahead and didn't respond. Another witness said the minivan was driving purposefully, not swerving erratically like a typical drunk driver, but rather proceeding steadily down the wrong side of the highway. Inside the minivan, the children were terrified. Emma Hans, at 8 years old, was old enough to understand that something was catastrophically wrong. She had already told her father on the phone that Aunt Diane couldn't see and couldn't speak properly. Now the minivan was going the wrong way on a highway with cars coming straight at them, horns blaring, drivers screaming. Emma and her sisters and cousins were screaming too, crying, begging Diane to stop. But Diane didn't stop. She continued driving south in the northbound lanes at approximately 85 miles per hour, highway speed, the same speed as the traffic coming toward her. This created closure rates of 170 miles per hour, as vehicles approached each other head-on. Northbound drivers had only seconds to react when they came over a rise or around a curve, and saw the red minivan coming straight at them in their lane. For nearly 2 miles and approximately 2 minutes, Diane continued driving the wrong way. Multiple near misses occurred as northbound drivers swerved onto the shoulder or into the southbound lanes to avoid collision. One witness later described it as the most terrifying thing I've ever seen, watching the minivan come directly at them, having to swerve at the last second, then watching in their rearview mirror as the minivan continued toward other drivers. State police units were dispatched immediately when the 911 calls began coming in, but they were minutes away. The Taconic State Parkway, while a major route, isn't as heavily patrolled as the interstate highways. The closest trooper was at least 5 miles away when the first call came in. Even driving at high speed with lights and sirens, it would take several minutes to reach the location of the wrong-way driver. And in those minutes, Diane Schuler would travel 2 miles down the wrong side of the highway. At approximately 1:35 p.m., Diane's red minivan came around a curve in the northbound lanes near the Pleasantville Road overpass, still traveling at high speed. Ahead of her, traveling northbound in the correct direction, was a white 2004 Chevrolet Trailblazer SUV driven by Guy Bastardi, 49 years old, with his father Michael Bastardi, 81, in the front passenger seat, and their friend Daniel Longo, 74, in the rear seat. The 3 men from Yonkers were returning from a fishing trip, heading home on what should have been an ordinary Sunday afternoon drive. Guy Bastardi saw the red minivan coming straight at him. He had perhaps 2 seconds to react. He swerved to the right, trying to get onto the shoulder, trying to avoid the head-on collision. But there wasn't enough time or space. The parkway at this location has limited shoulder width, with guardrails and trees close to the roadway. Diane's minivan, either by design or by impaired reflex, also moved in the same direction, cutting off Guy's escape route. The 2 vehicles collided head-on at a combined speed, estimated at over 140 miles per hour. The physics of the impact were catastrophic. Modern vehicles are designed to absorb and dissipate crash energy in moderate speed collisions, using crumple zones and safety systems to protect occupants. But no vehicle is designed to survive a 140 mile per hour head-on collision. The forces involved, measured in dozens of G-forces, are beyond the limits of human survival. The front end of the minivan crumpled backward, the engine block driven toward the passenger compartment. The windshield shattered, the steering column collapsed. The dashboard crushed inward. Diane Schuler, wearing her seatbelt, but subjected to forces no seatbelt could mitigate, sustained massive trauma to her head, chest and internal organs. She died instantly, probably before her brain could even register what had happened. The Trailblazer's front end also crumpled catastrophically, the frame buckling, the passenger compartment intruding on the occupants. All 3 men, Guy Bastardi, Michael Bastardi, and Daniel Longo, died instantly from massive blunt force trauma. Their bodies were found still belted in their seats, killed so quickly they likely never knew what hit them. In the rear of the minivan, the children were subjected to extreme deceleration forces as the vehicle went from 70+ miles per hour to 0 in a fraction of a second. 5-year-old Brian Schuler, strapped in his car seat in the 3rd row, was thrown forward against his restraints with tremendous force, but was partially protected by his car seat and the fact that he was further from the initial impact point. He sustained severe injuries, broken bones, head trauma, internal injuries, but survived. 2-year-old Erin Schuler, in her car seat closer to the front of the vehicle, was subjected to even greater forces. Despite her car seat and restraints, the trauma was too severe. She died at the scene from massive injuries. The 3 Hans sisters, Emma, 8 years old, and 7-year-old twins Allison and Kate, were all in the middle seats of the minivan, held by regular seatbelts but not in car seats. At the moment of impact, they were thrown forward with tremendous force. The deceleration trauma, combined with the crushing of the passenger compartment and the intrusion of debris and vehicle components, caused fatal injuries to all 3 girls. They died at the scene. The entire sequence, from the moment Guy Bastardi saw the minivan coming toward him to the moment both vehicles came to rest, took perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, 7 people died. The sound of the impact, described by witnesses as a thunderous boom that could be heard hundreds of yards away, was followed by a moment of eerie silence, then by the sound of car alarms, hissing radiators, and almost immediately, the screams and cries of witnesses and survivors. The 911 calls that had been reporting a wrong-way driver suddenly shifted to reports of a catastrophic crash. Multiple callers reported that 2 vehicles had collided head-on, that there were obviously multiple fatalities, that children were involved, that emergency response was urgently needed. The first calls reporting the crash came in at 1:36 p.m., within seconds of the impact. The Westchester County 911 system immediately dispatched multiple ambulances, fire units and police vehicles to the scene. The location, northbound Taconic State Parkway near the Pleasantville Road overpass, was accessible from several nearby municipalities, and first responders from multiple agencies began converging on the scene. The first units arrived within approximately 4 minutes of the crash. What they found was a scene of almost unimaginable devastation. The red Windstar minivan and the white Trailblazer were locked together in a mass of twisted metal. Both vehicles were virtually unrecognizable, crushed and torn apart by the violence of the impact. Debris was scattered across both lanes of the northbound parkway: glass, plastic, metal fragments, personal belongings from both vehicles. Inside the vehicles, the scene was even more horrific. First responders could immediately see that multiple people in both vehicles were obviously deceased. The positions of the bodies, the nature of the visible injuries, the lack of any signs of life, all made it clear that these weren't people who needed immediate medical attention, but rather victims who had died instantly in the crash. But from the rear of the minivan, first responders heard something that gave them hope: the sound of a child crying. Brian Schuler, still strapped in his car seat in the third row, was alive. He was severely injured. His injuries were immediately obvious, but he was conscious and responsive. This was the priority: get this child out of the wreckage and into an ambulance immediately. Firefighters worked quickly to extricate Brian from the crushed minivan. The rear hatch wouldn't open, jammed shut by the crash. They had to use hydraulic tools to pry open a door and carefully remove Brian's car seat with him still strapped in, trying to minimize movement of his injured body. Within minutes, Brian was out of the vehicle and being loaded into an ambulance. He was rushed to Westchester Medical Center, the regional trauma center, where a team was already standing by to receive him. With Brian safely evacuated, the first responders turned to the grim task of dealing with the deceased. 7 bodies had to be removed from the 2 vehicles, documented, and transported to the medical examiner. The New York State Police took control of the scene, as traffic fatalities on state highways fall under their jurisdiction. This wasn't just a tragic accident, it was a major crime scene that would require extensive investigation. The Taconic State Parkway was immediately closed in both directions at the crash site. Traffic was diverted to alternate routes. The closure would last for hours as investigators documented the scene, took measurements and photographs, collected evidence, and ultimately removed the vehicles and victims. Word of the crash spread quickly. Local news stations began reporting a major fatal accident on the Taconic. Family members of people who had been traveling on the parkway that day began calling frantically, trying to confirm their loved ones were safe. And Warren and Jackie Hance, who had been desperately trying to reach Diane and their daughters for hours, began to realize that their worst fears were coming true. Warren had been driving north, trying to find Diane, when he heard on the radio about a major crash on the Taconic involving a minivan. He called the state police, described Diane's vehicle, asked if the crash involved a red Ford Windstar. The trooper he spoke to couldn't confirm details immediately. The investigation was just beginning, but asked Warren to call back or come to a state police barracks to speak with investigators. Warren knew, even before the official notification, even before the positive identification of the vehicle and victims, Warren Hance knew that his 3 daughters were dead. The timing matched, the location matched, the description of the vehicle matched. He called Jackie, told her to meet him, that something terrible had happened. And then Warren and Jackie began the nightmare journey to officially learn what they already knew in their hearts. Emma, Alison, and Kate were gone. Daniel Schuler, meanwhile, was just arriving home on Long Island when he received a phone call from his father. Something had happened, his father said. There had been an accident. Diane and the kids were involved. Danny needed to call the police immediately. Danny, like Warren, knew before he was officially told, the woman he had spent his adult life with, the mother of his children, was dead. His daughter Erin was dead. Only Brian had survived. The Bastardi family, Guy's wife and children, Michael's wife, Daniel Longo's family, were notified by the state police that their loved ones had been killed in a crash on the Taconic. They had no idea at the time what had caused the crash, no idea that a wrong-way drunk driver had been responsible. They only knew that 3 men who had left that morning for a fishing trip would never come home. By evening on July 26, 2009, the basic facts of the crash were known: 8 people dead, 1 child survivor, 2 vehicles destroyed, a wrong-way driver responsible for the collision. What wasn't yet known, what wouldn't be known for several more days, was the most shocking fact of all. The driver of the minivan, the woman responsible for the crash, had been severely intoxicated. In any fatal traffic accident, particularly one as serious as this, autopsies and toxicology tests are standard procedure. The bodies of all 7 adult victims and child victims were transported to the Westchester County Medical Examiner's office. Dr. Millard Hyland, the Westchester County Medical Examiner, would personally oversee the autopsies and toxicology testing. The causes of death were straightforward. All 7 victims died from multiple blunt force trauma injuries sustained in the high-speed head-on collision. The injuries were so severe and so obviously immediately fatal that there was no question these deaths were the direct result of the crash itself. But the toxicology results on Diane Schuler would shock investigators, family members, and the public. Blood samples drawn during Diane's autopsy were sent for comprehensive toxicology analysis, testing for alcohol, drugs, prescription medications, and other substances. The results came back several days after the crash, and they were stunning. Diane Schuler's blood alcohol content, BAT, was measured at 0.19%. To put this in perspective, the legal limit for driving in New York State is 0.08%. Diane's BAT was more than twice the legal limit, a level of intoxication that would cause severe impairment in any person. At 0.19% BAT, a person typically experiences significant loss of motor control, severely impaired judgment, confusion, memory problems, and difficulty processing sensory information. Most people at this level of intoxication would be visibly drunk, slurred speech, unsteady gait, obvious impairment. But the blood alcohol content wasn't the only shocking finding. Analysis of the contents of Diane's stomach showed even higher concentrations of unabsorbed alcohol, suggesting she had consumed a large quantity of alcohol relatively shortly before the crash, possibly within an hour or two. The presence of unabsorbed alcohol indicated that Diane had been drinking during the drive itself, or just before leaving the campground that morning. Additionally, toxicology testing found THC tetrahydrocannabinol, the active ingredient in marijuana, in Diane's blood and urine. The levels detected indicated she had used marijuana at some point before or during the trip. While marijuana intoxication is harder to quantify than alcohol intoxication, the combination of significant alcohol intoxication and marijuana use would have created severe impairment, the two substances potentiating each other's effects. When these toxicology results were released to the public on July 28, 2009, just 2 days after the crash, the story transformed from a tragic accident into something far more disturbing and controversial. The woman who had been driving 5 children, the responsible mother and professional, had been drunk and high behind the wheel. The immediate question on everyone's mind was how did this happen? How did nobody notice, and why did Diane Schuler drive drunk with 5 children in her vehicle? The revelation shattered the initial narrative. In the first 2 days after the crash, Diane had been portrayed as a victim, a mother who perhaps had a medical emergency at the wheel, who perhaps suffered a stroke or seizure. Her family and friends defended her character, insisting she wasn't the type of person who would ever drive drunk, especially with children in the car. Daniel Schuler told reporters his wife rarely drank, never used drugs, was a responsible and careful person. But the toxicology results were unambiguous. This wasn't a borderline case. A blood alcohol content of 0.19% is severe intoxication. The marijuana use added another layer. And the pattern of evidence, the phone calls describing disorientation, the witnesses seeing erratic driving and stumbling behavior, the decision to drive the wrong way for 2 miles, all suddenly made sense in the context of severe substance intoxication. The medical examiner's office stood by its findings. When the Schuler family demanded independent testing, samples were sent to an independent laboratory. The results were confirmed. Diane Schuler had been severely intoxicated at the time of the crash. No error. No contamination. Just the undeniable truth that a mother had driven drunk and high with 5 children in her vehicle, killing 8 people. As investigators dug deeper into Diane Schuler's life, a darker picture emerged. The capable, organized woman everyone thought they knew had been hiding a serious problem. The most damning evidence was found in the wreckage itself, a large bottle of absolute vodka, nearly empty, broken in the debris. Diane had been drinking vodka from this bottle during the drive, probably starting sometime after leaving the campground. Family members, pressed by investigators, reluctantly admitted troubling details. Diane routinely kept alcohol in her car. Co-workers had occasionally smelled alcohol on her breath. She constantly chewed gum or mints, a classic sign of someone trying to mask the smell of alcohol. Some family members had noticed she drank more than seemed normal at gatherings, though never to obvious drunkenness. Most significantly, Diane had severe untreated dental problems, abscessed teeth, extensive decay, that she'd been ignoring for months, despite obvious pain. Forensic experts noted that such severe dental problems in a young adult are often associated with chronic alcohol abuse. The theory emerged that Diane may have been drinking that morning specifically to cope with dental pain, using alcohol as self-medication. The picture of a high-functioning alcoholic emerged, someone who maintained a successful career, fulfilled family responsibilities, presented a competent facade, while secretly drinking heavily. These individuals are extraordinarily skilled at hiding their addiction. They drink alone, conceal evidence, experience profound shame that prevents them from seeking help. They believe they have control because they're still functioning. Daniel Schuler maintained he had never seen Diane drunk, never suspected a problem. Either he was lying, or Diane had been extraordinarily skilled at compartmentalizing her drinking. Or perhaps, as is often the case in families affected by addiction, Danny had been in denial, unconsciously choosing not to see warning signs, because acknowledging them would have required difficult confrontations and changes. The investigation concluded definitively: Diane Schuler was responsible. She had chosen to drink and use marijuana. She had chosen to drive while intoxicated. She had chosen to continue driving even when she knew something was wrong. Her choices killed 8 people. Diane herself was dead, so criminal prosecution was impossible, but civil liability remained. Warren and Jackie Hance filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Daniel Schuler, seeking accountability for their daughters' deaths. The Bastardi family, who lost Guy Michael and Daniel Longo, filed similar suits. Remarkably, Daniel Schuler filed a countersuit against Warren Hance, claiming Warren had been supplying Diane with marijuana and had failed to tell Danny about her substance use. This countersuit was widely seen as a desperate, offensive attempt to deflect responsibility. The lawsuits dragged through the courts for years. In 2013, they settled. The Hance family received approximately $122,000 from various insurance policies, a pittance for the loss of 3 daughters, but all that was legally available. The Bastardi family received similar small settlements. Daniel's countersuit was dismissed. The legal system provided no real justice. The families received token compensation that could never replace their loved ones. Daniel Schuler faced no meaningful accountability, continuing to insist he had done nothing wrong, and that Diane's alcoholism was news to him. Brian Schuler, the sole survivor, underwent years of medical treatment for his injuries. He has no memory of the crash. As he grows older, he will learn the full truth, that his mother killed his sister, his cousins and 3 strangers while driving drunk. The psychological burden of this knowledge is almost incomprehensible. Daniel Schuler and Diane's extended family never accepted the toxicology results. They promoted alternative theories. Perhaps Diane had auto-brewery syndrome, a rare condition where the gut produces alcohol. Medical experts universally rejected this. The syndrome is extraordinarily rare, wouldn't produce such high alcohol levels, and doesn't explain the marijuana or the vodka bottle found in the wreckage. Other theories suggested stroke, poisoning, or accidental overdose of painkillers. None had any evidentiary support. The autopsy found no stroke. The toxicology showed alcohol and marijuana, but no painkillers at dangerous levels. Every alternative theory collapsed under scrutiny. Danny appeared in media interviews, including a 2011 HBO documentary, There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane, maintaining Diane wasn't an alcoholic. His denial struck observers as either delusional or deliberately dishonest. Some psychologists suggest Danny may be psychologically incapable of accepting the truth. Doing so would shatter his self-image and force him to confront his own failures to recognize and address Diane's addiction. Warren and Jackie Hance eventually accepted the truth. Warren wrote a book, I'll See You Again, expressing his grief, anger, and gradual acceptance that Diane was responsible. He expressed regret that he hadn't recognized warning signs, hadn't pushed harder when Diane called saying she couldn't see clearly, hadn't somehow stopped the tragedy. Jackie Hans spoke about the impossible pain of losing 3 children simultaneously, the guilt about letting them go on the trip, the rage at Diane. Eventually Warren and Jackie had 3 more daughters, not as replacements, but as a choice for life over despair. The Bastardi family remained vocally critical of any narrative portraying Diane as a victim. Jay Bastardi wrote The Taconic Tragedy, A Son's Search for the Truth, arguing that Diane made conscious choices to drive drunk, and that sympathy shouldn't overshadow the fact she killed innocent people. His father, grandfather and their friend were completely innocent victims who died because of Diane's criminal behavior. One mystery remains: was the wrong-way drive accidental or intentional? Did Diane become so impaired she didn't realize she was going the wrong way? Or did she intentionally drive into oncoming traffic in a murder-suicide? The fact that she drove nearly 2 miles at high speed without correcting course suggests possible intentionality. She had opportunities to exit or stop but didn't. Some investigators believe this indicates she was deliberately driving toward a collision. However, extreme intoxication could explain the same facts. At 0.19% BAC plus marijuana, she may have been too impaired to process what was happening or respond appropriately. Perhaps she was experiencing tunnel vision, profound confusion, inability to recognize her error. Some experts suggest Diane may have reached a psychological breaking point. The stress she carried, the physical pain from dental problems, the effects of intoxication, perhaps some triggering event, all combining into a crisis where she became suicidal or simply stopped caring about consequences. We'll never know what Diane was thinking during those final minutes. The only person who could answer is dead. What we know is that her actions, drinking, using drugs, driving, failing to stop, resulted in unspeakable tragedy that destroyed multiple families. The Taconic crash offers painful lessons about addiction, family dynamics and prevention. High-functioning alcoholics like Diane maintain successful facades while secretly struggling. Warning signs are subtle: drinking alone, hiding alcohol, needing it to cope with stress, neglecting health issues, defensiveness when drinking is mentioned. In Diane's case, these signs existed but weren't recognized or acted upon. The family dynamics raise questions about enabling. Daniel's claim of complete ignorance strains credibility. Enabling occurs when family members make excuses, cover up problems, or refuse to confront issues. Whether Danny was truly unaware or in active denial, the lack of intervention allowed Diane's drinking to continue unchecked. Multiple witnesses saw Diane impaired that morning, but nobody called 911 until too late. This highlights the failure of bystander intervention and our cultural reluctance to interfere in others' business. When we see impaired drivers, what's our obligation? Several witnesses offered help. Diane refused. Should they have done more? Called police immediately. Physically prevented her from driving. These are difficult questions without easy answers. The crash also highlighted wrong-way driving prevention. In the years since, states have improved signage, lighting and detection systems. But the fundamental problem remains: severely impaired drivers may not process warnings or recognize errors. No system is foolproof against someone as intoxicated as Diane was. Most heartbreaking is that 4 children died, children who had no choice, who depended on adults to keep them safe, who were betrayed by that trust. Every adult driving with children assumes responsibility not just for their own life but for those children's lives. Driving impaired with children aboard is profound betrayal. As of 2024, 15 years have passed since that Sunday afternoon. The physical evidence is gone, vehicles scrapped, roadway repaired, bloodstains washed away. Life continues on the Taconic, most travelers unaware they're passing one of New York's worst traffic disasters. But for the affected families, time hasn't erased the pain. The Hanses rebuilt their lives around their 3 younger daughters, but Emma, Allison and Kate's loss remains a permanent wound. They speak of learning to live with grief rather than getting over it. The Bastardi family continues advocating for drunk driving awareness. Jay Bastardi hopes his father's and grandfather's deaths serve as warning to others about devastating consequences of impaired driving. Daniel Schuler has largely disappeared from public view, seeking privacy for himself and Brian. Brian is now a young adult, facing the challenges of building a life in tragedy's shadow. His path forward is uniquely difficult. The documentary There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane brought national attention to the case, exploring competing narratives without providing easy answers. The case continues generating discussion online, with debates about whether Diane was a victim of untreated illness or a perpetrator who made selfish, reckless choices. Both perspectives contain truth. Conclusion: a preventable tragedy. The 2009 Taconic crash was not an accident, it was a preventable tragedy caused by human choices and failures. Diane chose to drink and use marijuana, she chose to drive while intoxicated. She chose to continue driving when she knew something was wrong. These choices, combined with family failure to address her addiction and system failures to prevent impaired driving, resulted in 8 deaths. The warning signs existed but weren't adequately recognized or addressed. Her family didn't see or didn't acknowledge her alcohol problem. Co-workers noticed signs but didn't intervene. Social norms, family support, workplace awareness, bystander intervention, all failed. 8 people died because these interventions didn't happen. Diane Schuler, who needed help she never received. 2-year-old Erin Schuler, whose life was just beginning. 8-year-old Emma Hans, and 7-year-old twins Allison and Kate, 3 sisters who died together. Guy Bastardi, 49, Michael Bastardi, 81, and Daniel Longo, 74, 3 men on an ordinary Sunday drive who never made it home. Their deaths were not inevitable. They resulted from failures of recognition, intervention and responsibility. That makes the tragedy more painful. It could have been prevented. 8 people might still be alive if someone had recognized Diane's problem and insisted she get help. 4 children might still be growing up if Diane had made different choices. 3 innocent men might still be with families if systems had prevented Diane from driving the wrong way. The Taconic crash stands as devastating reminder of impaired driving consequences, addiction's hidden nature, and intervention's importance even when uncomfortable. It reminds us that competence facades can hide profound struggles, that children depend absolutely on adults to protect them. That one person's choice to drive intoxicated can destroy multiple lives instantly. The lives lost cannot be restored, the families shattered cannot be made whole. But perhaps by understanding what happened and why, by learning these lessons we can prevent similar tragedies. That is the only meaning we can find in this senseless loss, that these 8 people did not die entirely in vain, that their deaths might contribute to saving other lives. The red minivan going the wrong way on that summer afternoon has become a symbol of how quickly things can go catastrophically wrong, how hidden problems can explode into public tragedy, and how one person's impairment extends far beyond that individual. It serves as stark reminder that drunk driving is not victimless, that addiction affects everyone around the addict, and that the responsibility to intervene, to speak up, to confront, to act, belongs to all of us.